Today I'm going to be going over damper and drag setting, how those two things are different, how they're similar, how they interact because they kind of do a little bit, and we're going to get into it. You're going to learn all about that today in this video. First up, we have damper setting. So the damper setting on your Concept 2 rowing machine is going to be on the side of your flywheel. So those are going to be the numbers from 1 to 10. So notice how I have a Model C rowing machine. You may have a Model D, which is a slightly newer version. So your numbers are going to be approximately in the same spot. The flywheel, I believe the numbers are a little bit bigger, but it still does the same thing, even though it might look a little bit different than mine does. It still does the same thing. So what is the damper setting? What is it doing? So when we're all the way down at a 1, I want you to watch this. When I go down all the way to a 1, it blocks off the air. Not all of it, but most of it. So when it's blocking off that air, the flywheel is not able to pull in as much air as it's spinning. So then it keeps spinning. There's not as much air in there to slow it down. Now, watch this again. As I put it all the way up to 10, it opens up all the way. So when it opens up, now we have a lot more air being pulled in, and now the flywheel is being slowed down a lot. When you're rowing and the flywheels, every time you pull, that flywheel is going to spin. When you're up at a 10, the maximum amount of air is going to be pulled into that flywheel and it's going to slow down a lot faster. So that's why at higher damper settings, it tends to feel heavier. So want to be careful not to call this a resistance setting though, because one thing that's really important to remember is that you are the resistance setting for a rowing machine. A rowing machine is a variable resistance machine. Again, meaning that you're the resistance setting. That can seem a little bit confusing, but stay with me. So when you press harder on the machine, pushing and pulling harder, the machine is going to resist you more. That's what makes you the resistance setting. This changes how much the flywheel slows down or not. So an analogy that I like to use is it's kind of like gears on a bike. So when you're biking, you're going along, when you're at a 1 in that, or the lowest gear, then you're kind of spinning your wheels. It's hard to get any power behind it. Your feet just kind of go fast and you feel like you're not really going anywhere. That's kind of what happens when you're all the way down at a 1. With that flywheel keeps spinning so easily. So, but again, on a bike, when you're at the highest setting, whatever that may be for your bike, then it's like the pedals are super heavy, and maybe if you had to do an all-out sprint, you could do it for maybe 30 seconds or a minute, but otherwise, like, you're tapped out really quickly. So, kind of similar thing on here. This feels so heavy, but again, how fast you're going and biking is going to depend on you. So, same thing here, how fast you're going is going to be, and your split that you get is going to be how much power you're putting into the machine. So definitely keep that in mind, that this is not a resistance setting, that you're the resistance setting. This just changes how much air is being pulled into the flywheel. So that causes the flywheel to slow down. At a 1, will slow down less, or maybe it will take a while to slow down, versus at a 10, where it's going to slow down very quickly and feel heavier. So what's the ideal setting? The ideal setting for a damper is somewhere around a 3 to a 5. Most start at a 4-ish. So there's a reason for that. Going back to that biking analogy. When we think about biking on gears, typically that gear that we like to sit at is somewhere around the middle, maybe a little bit less than that middle setting, because you're able to keep moving, but you can put some power behind it. And depending on, if you have to go uphill and go fast for a second, you can change the gear, and then For certain situations, you might want a lower gear, certain situations, you might want a higher gear. So similar thing here with rowing workouts. So 3 to 5 is about the ideal range. If it's a longer piece, you might find that you like the damper a little bit lower, maybe closer to a 3. If you have quite a bit of power behind you and you're doing some shorter pieces, maybe you want to be a little bit closer to a 5. So that's going to kind of depend on you and what you want to do. You don't always have to change the damper setting for the workout that you're doing. If you like to row at a 4, you're comfortable there, even if it's a longer workout or shorter workout, like that is totally fine. If you have a setting that you prefer and you just want to stay there, then you do you, that's totally fine. But if you find that you're kind of getting really taxed, it's hard to keep pulling, especially on those longer pieces, I suggest for you to try a slightly lower damper setting the next time you do a piece that's that long. So that's a little bit about the damper and what it is, how you change it, what it's actually changing, and yeah. So if you have any questions, again, feel free to drop those in the comments. Next, we're going to go over the drag factor. So drag factor and damper are definitely related. We'll get into that in a second. The drag factor you find in your monitor. So to find that, you can turn on your monitor. You can go to, if you're at PM5, it's going to be more options and then display drag factor. So what you're going to do when you're on this screen is you're going to row for a couple strokes, give it about at least 3 to 5 and see what number comes up. So that number, if you're sitting around a 3 to a 5, can be anywhere from maybe 95 to like 120, 125, kind of depending on your machine, where you have it, and things like that. We'll get into some of that in a little bit here. So you can take a couple strokes right there to kind of find out what your current drag factor is at your damper setting. So what is drag factor? What the drag factor is it's a more numerical value, I guess, of how fast that flywheel is slowing down. So typical drag factor numbers for women are mostly around maybe like 90 to 120, 125. For guys, it might be about 100 to 135-ish. And most of the time, that's about that 3 to 5 range, give or take, on the damper setting. Now, that's not always the case, and I'll use my rower as a prime example. So this is a Model C. It's a little bit older machine. So different machines at the same drag factor can have different damper settings. I'll say that again. It can be a little confusing. If you have 2 different machines, they're both at a drag factor of 100. On one machine, it might be a 3.5-ish. The other machine, it might be closer to a 3. Why is that? So why, if we're at the same drag factor, is our damper setting different on 2 machines? Isn't that crazy? It's weird, right? So the reason being is it can depend on how old your rower is. Maybe it's dusty inside. That can have an effect. If maybe you go from rowing at home to you're traveling somewhere and it's an altitude, that's going to make a difference. If your flywheel is close to a wall, that's going to affect how much air is being pulled in. That can have a difference. Maybe your rowing machine is next to the fan in the gym. Who knows? There's a lot of different factors that can change how much air is being pulled in. And so if you use different machines, maybe you have one at home, have one at the gym. If you want to find the same feel, then you want to know what drag factor you like to use, because then you can sit down, you can look up the drag factor, see what setting is that setting that you want. Let's say it's 110. You figure out where 110 is, and it's going to feel exactly like the rower at home that you use, that you always have it set to 110. That's what that's going to help you do. Now, do you have to use drag factor? You definitely don't have to, especially if you're just starting out and you just kind of want to stick with that 3 to 5 damper setting rule, then you can do that. That's totally fine. So kind of going back to the example of my machine is, since this machine is older, The drag factor of about 120 is actually closer to a 2 for my machine. But I can use drag factor to find the drag factor that I want, and my settings seem to be a little bit lower just because it's an older model, an older machine. That sometimes tends to happen. But if you have a Model D, I don't want you to worry too much about that because newer Model Ds, they're all going to be pretty much the same in that 3 to 5 range. It just might be little small movements to get that drag factor that you want. Now, I kind of mentioned earlier that typical range for women is about maybe that 90 to 120, 125. So I mentioned earlier about the damper and shorter and longer workouts. Same thing kind of applies to drag factor, but now you have a little more accurate number to put it against. So maybe for longer pieces, you'd like that drag factor to be closer to 95 to 100. Maybe on some shorter pieces, you want it to be closer to, maybe you're okay with like 115, 120. It's going to kind of depend on what you want to try and what you want to do. Same thing with the drag factor though. Feel free to try it out on different types of workouts. Try out longer workouts at a 90, try one at 100, see what feels better, see where you're more efficient. But kind of sticking to that range is going to be helpful. Much like how we don't want to go too high on the damper setting, we don't want to go too high on the drag factor. If they're shorter pieces though, even that 115 to 125 can be a good place to start. Much higher than that, and you're going to burn out really quickly, much like, again, that higher gear on that bike where you can go, but be careful because if you still got enough time left in that piece, you're going to burn out pretty quick at that high gear. So that's kind of what you can use drag factor for, especially if you're going across machines, or you can use it for changing up workouts on the machine that you have with short and long pieces. Here's one last bonus tip for your drag factor on race day or your damper setting. First of all, and most importantly, practice the drag factor that you're going to use on race day. So depending on the race length, it might be 500, it might be a 2K or a 5K. That might change what damper setting or drag factor that you want to use. If you want to be more accurate, you're going to definitely want to use drag factor. So, but the biggest thing is practice the drag factor that you're going to want to race in at the machine that you have. Because if you practice at a drag factor of 110 and you're able to set the drag factor of that race machine up at 110, the feeling is going to be exactly the same, even if the damper setting that it's set to is a little bit different. So for race day, if you want it to feel the same, definitely figure out the drag factor that you want to use as long as you're able to set that and change it before you do your race. As always, thanks for watching this video. If you have any questions on damper or drag, feel free to drop those in the comments. Again, also if you liked what you learned today, feel free to hit the subscribe button, and I will see you in the next video.